I'm sure there'll be some people filtering in as this conversation gets underway. If you're having any trouble hearing me, definitely let us know in the chat if you're having any issues technically on that side. We want to welcome you to the first in a series of webinars that the State Data Center is going to be putting on. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. With us, we have Erin Hatfield, who's in the control room / living room, dining room, wherever she may be today. And also Nicholas Nagle from an undisclosed location somewhere in East Tennessee, who's going to be presenting the Differential Privacy webinar today. If you were at our fall conference in October in Nashville, we talked about having a webinar on this topic, the topic of differential privacy. There's been a lot of developments in this area since we kind of made that commitment. And I think it's a good time to go ahead and give you an update on where things stand. So I think you're going to enjoy hearing about it. Speaking of our fall conference, it is very much in limbo at this point. We're not going to commit to holding the conference at this time. That is why we're kind of starting this webinar series to kind of keep that training opportunity rolling as we kind of go through the next couple months and see how things develop. We may take a break over the summer, but we'll definitely spark it back up in the fall, starting in September, and get it going again. But we may, if opportunities arise, do additional training. The next one is going to be on Thursday, June 18th at 2 p.m. It is going to be on a new census data tool called the Microdata Access Tool, or MDAT. It's a replacement for a long-needed replacement for an old product called Data Ferret, which was a bit of a challenge to use, in my opinion. But I think you're going to like seeing this new tool. It is a tool for accessing census microdata, including the current population survey, but more importantly, the American Community Survey public use microdata samples. And the ACS PUMS is a very powerful data set, but you really needed to have some sort of statistical tools to get into it and use it. This software kind of changes all that. And so the real advantage to using this type of software is it lets you get access to answer questions that you can't get in the standard tables that were provided to the American Community Survey, the pre-tabulated things. So an example might be how many grandparent-headed households ride their bike to work. That's not a tabulation you're going to find in ACS, but this is the type of thing that you might be able to compile or get some sort of an answer to using the microdata samples. We've used it at the Boyd Center to evaluate some COVID-19 response policies, including doing some things like calculating the number of family households by the number of people in the family at certain income thresholds with the presence of children above and below certain ages. So it can there is margins of error, of course, associated with all this, but it is a very powerful tool to getting at a very precise set of data. And we're going to have Kaneen Reese do that presentation. She also came to our fall conference and presented a data.census.gov session. She is the chief of the dissemination outreach branch at the Census Bureau. And she's a really great speaker because she helps, she's good at presenting the topic, presenting what its capabilities are, but she also knows the product roadmaps, what features are coming, what things are working on, and what things that you might not see. So we're going to be really lucky to have Kaneen do that. All right, so we're going to transition into Nicholas's presentation. Just a couple of minor housekeeping things. First is, it looks like most of the mics are muted. I think Aaron's kind of double checking that everyone keeps their mics muted. We can't do that for you, so just do us a favor and keep your microphone muted. We are going to take questions because we want to give you a chance to ask Nicholas anything that comes up as you hear his presentation this afternoon. And do that by putting your question into the chat, and we'll queue those questions up, and maybe if we get some similar types of questions, we'll try to present those all at once. Feel free to put those in as the presentation goes on, or if you want to hold off and put them at the end, we can help with that as well. So with that, I want to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nicholas Nagle. He is an associate professor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and he's associate head of the Department of Geography. His research expertise is in developing technologies for estimating the characteristics of small places using surveys and other geographic data. And his research has been funded by the Census Bureau, Forest Service, U.S. Department of Energy, and the National Science Foundation. He's also served on some various National Academy of Sciences committees that provide expert guidance to the U.S. Census Bureau. And that's one of the primary reasons we have him as a speaker this afternoon, is he's currently sitting on a panel that advises the U.S. Census Bureau on the differential privacy discussions that are ongoing. He chairs a subcommittee on the geographic, some of the geographic discussions that are going on around this area. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Nagle, and hope you enjoy this presentation.
Thank you, Tim. First of all, can you hear me just fine?
Yeah, we got you.
All right. So I've broken this into 3 sections today. First, I want to kind of give a high-level overview of what is differential privacy, because it's very new technology, and how Census is implementing differential privacy. And then the next part, I'll talk about some way the Census has released a test product applying differential privacy to the 2010 census. And it's not the final product at all, but I'll talk about what we've learned about differential privacy from that and some of the problems to look forward as they iterate and refine the process. And that'll be the final part is how is the Census trying to refine the process? Where are we, and where is the Census going? So with that, thought about how I would explain differential privacy to my kids, for example. And so the problem differential privacy tries to solve is, suppose Facebook or Department of Homeland Security has a very thorough database of the United States, but maybe they're missing some people. In this case, maybe they're missing Claire. And the question is, can Facebook take their data like this? They've got complete information on David and Joe and Alex. Can I take their information, match that with the census tables, and find out something about Claire that they don't already know? And the answer to that is, well, yeah, they can. If Facebook looks at their data, they can find out how many women are in their data, how many people have red hair or hats or glasses in their data, and they can compare that with the census tables. The census table might say, they were doing guess who, the census table might say, how many women are there, how many people have red hair? And then Facebook can look at the difference. And that's where differential privacy comes from. That's what the difference is. They can look at the difference between their data and the census tables and say, hey, look, even though Claire's not in her data, we know that she must be a female with red hair and wears a hat and wears glasses, because that's the difference between our 2 data sets. So differential privacy is kind of a worst case scenario where the census is asking the question, is there somebody out there who may have almost complete information, and can they use our data to find out data that they don't have? And if so, that's not what we want to do for the Census Bureau. So the Census Bureau did this type of finding and basically looked at how many Claires were there in the United States in which somebody with the right access to data could use the census and fill in some missing pieces. And what they found out was that about, using the 2010 decennial census data, which is age, race, sex, and ethnicity, about 17% of Americans could be reconstructed from the decennial census by, we call them an adversary with the right data. And so the way Census did that was they, basically purchased data from credit bureaus and from banks and wherever they could find it, and said, can someone with all this data find out things about the people, about Americans that they wouldn't know otherwise? And that's what they found, is that basically the 2010 census compromised the privacy of about 17% of Americans. And that was quite a shock to the Census Bureau. They were expecting that number to be much, much lower. They did this research, 2016, 2017, thereabouts, and they knew that they had to change the way they were doing things. The process that they've developed, they've adopted this technology called differential privacy. The technology is only about 15 years old or so, and it was designed by a computer scientist at Harvard named Cynthia Dwork. And she actually had the census in mind when she developed this strategy. But the way the Census Bureau is trying to protect privacy in 2020 is basically a 2-step process. And I'll show how this works in a second. But in the first step, they take their counts, how many people live in Tennessee, how many African Americans live in Tennessee, how many African American males live in Tennessee, how many in Knoxville, et cetera. They take their tables and they add noise to every single one of those numbers. In doing that, they break the tables in various ways. And so they have to do a post-processing step to try to fix all those tables so that they agree with one another. And so here's an example. This is kind of how the Census Bureau is thinking about the geography of America, if you will. They've got a hierarchical process. And there's a nation at the top, and then there's the states, and then there's counties, and then there's tracts and block groups and blocks below that. And so these are actually the census counts from 2010. There are 300 or so million people in the United States in 2010, of whom 147 million were males, et cetera. And so you can imagine that in 2020, the Census Bureau would get a table just like this, and it would be the actual count for all these different tabulations. But what the Census Bureau has decided is that they can't produce this tabulation anymore because perhaps 17% of Americans might have their confidentiality broken or diminished by releasing these data. So they're not going to release these data exactly. What differential privacy does is it adds noise to each and every count in that table. And so the distribution of noise looks something like these red curves. They use something called the Laplace distribution. But imagine there's a truth, and then what they do is they add some noise, some positive or negative number to that truth. So that rather than releasing the truth, what gets published is some number that's not the truth. There's a high likelihood that it's around the truth, but there's also a pretty high likelihood that it's really far away from the truth. This distribution has really fat tails, we call it. It's not exactly a Gaussian distribution or a normal curve. They can control what this curve looks like, whether or not it's tiny, like the one on the bottom left, whether or not it's really spread out, like the one on the bottom right. There's a number that evaluates this, and they use the letter epsilon to evaluate how much noise is added. Checking the bottom left, that's a distribution that doesn't add a lot of noise. And in the bottom right, that's a distribution that could add a huge amount of noise. And so epsilon is the one on the left we say has a high epsilon. It releases a lot of information because it's not creating noise. If you create noise, you lose information. So the one on the right, we've lost a lot of information. We've created privacy. The one on the left, we haven't lost a lot of information. We haven't created a lot of privacy. So they're basically taking these distributions and adding them to each and every number on that table. And you can basically add up how much noise is added. And epsilon is how they're quantifying how much noise is added. And so as you start to become aware of this debate, you might hear people talk about what's called the Epsilon budget. Basically, that means how much noise are they adding? They're creating like a budget of how much noise they're adding. And there's a lot of discussions as to what is the right amount of noise. But how this ends up getting applied is something, hopefully this makes sense, but like you can take the number of males in the United States, and according to the census, that was 147 million. They're not going to release that number, 147 million. They're going to release 147 million plus or minus something from this red curve. And they're going to do the same thing for females, blacks, black males, black females, et cetera. They're going to do the same thing for males in Tennessee, the same thing for males in Anderson County, Davidson County, the same thing for males in Tract 1 of Anderson County, Tract 2, et cetera. So they're going to add noise to each and every single number on the table. I've circled the population counts for Tennessee and for United States because those are just about the only numbers that are not going to have noise added to them, and that is the population counts for the states. And if you know the population counts for the states, you obviously know the population count for the US. They can't add noise to that because that's their interpretation of the Constitution is for reapportioning Congress. You need to have a reliable count of the number of people in each state. So there's no noise there, but every other number in the decennial census is having noise added to that. As caveat, technicality, there's one other number that they're not adding noise to, and that actually creates a lot of problems. They're not adding noise to the housing unit counts at the block level. So kind of weirdly, they're not adding noise to population at the state level, and they're not adding noise to the housing unit count at the block level, but everything else is noise added to that. When they do this, they've basically broken the tables in important ways. So like, for example, if you take the 84 black males and tract 3 at the bottom and you add some noise, it's possible that you'll get a negative number. If you add noise to the number of males and females, they may no longer add up to the total. And so differential adds protection, it adds privacy, as they say, but it completely breaks the table and makes it unfit for most uses. So the Tennessee population is given, but they're adding noise to the counts for every county. If you add up those noisy counties, you won't get back the state total. If you add up the number of males and females, you won't get back the population. If you add up the races, by sex here, for example, you won't get back the total number of males. You get some negative numbers. And so what they're doing is they're taking these now noisy data, which are completely protected according to differential privacy, and basically rearranging them in ways to try to make all these numbers add up again. And so this is called the post-processing step. And the goal of the post-processing is to create new tables. So kind of think about, we've got the original table, we've got the noisy table. We're now going to create a new table, which is as close as possible to the noisy table, but that is consistent. So when you add up all the counties, you get the state total. When you add up all the races, you get the population total. All the numbers are bigger than 0, et cetera. Unfortunately, this step does create bias. And this bias is especially noticeable for all the small counts in the census. And actually think about it, if you think of all the millions of numbers that are produced by the census, most of those numbers are at the block level and the block group level. Most of those numbers are small. And we do get a lot of bias in the small numbers. Comes out because basically if you've got a small number, you're not going to go negative. So chances are that you're going to go positive rather than smaller. I've got this little curve here. If the truth is somewhere, say 10, you can go 0, 1 through 9. You can also go 11 up to 100 or 1,000. There's no limit on it. So there's a bound on the bottom, but there's not a bound on the right. And this creates some bias. And you'll see examples of this bias in the next part. So that's kind of in a nutshell what differential privacy looks like at the census, why they're doing it, why they think they need to do it, how they're implementing it. As I said, if you keep in mind kind of discussion going forward, you might hear talk about things like the Epsilon Budget, and that's basically how much noise are they adding to all these tables. Add up all the tables, it's like a budget. You only want to release so much privacy. So in last fall sometime, I think it was October or November, the Census Bureau released a version of the 2010 data that had differential privacy added to them. So we could actually look at what the actual 2010 data looked like and what the noisy corrected data might look like. There was a panel of the National Academies convened, and I presented some of this material at that. And there are a lot of ways that people pointed out to the census that basically the data aren't fit for use, at least not as they were presented in that fall test case. I looked mostly at how census data are used in state statutes. And we have statutes in Tennessee that require us to use census population counts. And we've always assumed that the population counts for cities are accurate. And we've written that into laws. And that just may not be the case anymore. So for example, here's some language from Tennessee Code that allocates a small portion of sales and use taxes back to places and counties using the census. They get updated every every 10 years. Cities can do their own special censuses if they're not happy or if they think there's been growth. But the baseline is the assumption that what we get every 10 years from the census is accurate. So one thing we did here was we took that legislation and we looked at what happens if that was the truth and if that was the data we had in 2010. How would we have misallocated funds to communities if we had used the noisy data rather than the true data? In this particular allocation, it changes every year, but places get about $110, $120 per capita per year. And if you allocate based on the noisy data, some places may, if they get undercounted, they may not get the money they deserve. If they get overcounted, they may get more than they deserve. And so it creates some definite winners and losers. And in fact, the difference in per capita spending that would have gone to the biggest winners versus the biggest losers was just about double, a little bit more actually. Most places don't have a big impact, but there is some real disparities that are created, at least by the data that we saw that was released back in the fall. Here's an idea of how that noise looks for different places in Tennessee. So every one of these dots is a place in Tennessee. I've chopped off some of the no, actually that's all of them. So you've got, Memphis, and on the right there, we've got some really tiny places on the left. Notice the log scaling here. But if you look at the changes in revenues per person, most places, say places about 10,000 and above, aren't affected by that much, but a lot of these small rural places could see big differences in the amount of money that they're getting per person. Here's just a few examples at different places and kind of the population hierarchy. We've got a column for what their actual population was in 2010, what is a theoretical number that they could have gotten with differential privacy, and how much that means in terms of dollars per capita. And so, for places like Clarksville, Murfreesboro, not a big difference. But for some of these small towns, dollar-wise, it's not a big difference. But for a place with 1,000 people to lose, or a place with 500 people to lose $10,000 a year, that could be a heck of a big difference. And so that's something to be concerned about is what's going to happen with small places. And again, I want to emphasize that this is money that's kind of allocated under the assumption that the census data are accurate. And what we're going to get is we're no longer going to get accurate numbers. We're going to get something else, something not accurate. Overall, we've got this slight bias in that small places tend to gain people and large places tend to lose people. Here, the error is the y-axis is in absolute numbers, not fractions. So like a big place like 1 million people may lose 2,000 people. Do they really care if 1 million goes down by 2,000? But some of these small places could have quite big differences. Places less than 10,000 could be impacted quite a bit by this. These are all the places in the United States, actually. So in general, across the entire US, places less than 10,000, on average, they gains people. But there's a large variability there, as you saw earlier. Large variability, there's some real losers. But on average, they gain. And on average, the larger places lose. Another thing that this affects is the rural places all across America actually gain slightly using this noise. And in general, there's a large shift of people nationwide from urban places to rural places when you add noise. And again, these rural places are small. And so small, there's, sometimes the noise is going to create a negative number and you can't have that. So in general, the rural places are going to have a slightly positive bias. Any small number is actually going to have a slightly positive bias after you do differential privacy and then apply the post-processing. This chart is all the urban places in America. And you can see most of the dots are below 0%. So most of the urban places shrink according to this. And if the urban places are shrinking, that means that the rural population of the United States is going up. And keep in mind, nobody's actually moved. This is just an artifact of adding noise to the data and then applying that post-processing step. These are charts of age composition. So the population of school districts, and I chose a bunch of school districts out here in East Tennessee. And this is the population inside the school district at every age from 0 to 18. The black line is the truth from the 2010 data, and then the red noise is what they would have published if they had applied differential privacy. And you can see there's some huge disparities. The black line is pretty even from year to year. There's some trends, like Anderson County in the middle there has some trends going up or going down as you get to younger ages. It's hard to see those trends oftentimes with the noisy data. You can see these huge year-to-year fluctuations in the noisy data. You wouldn't be able, for example, to use the decennial census to figure out how many people are going to be going into school in the next year because there's a large fluctuation from year to year. What this is going to mean for users is if we want to use like one of these red curves, we're not going to be able to use single year data, a single age group data. We're going to have to, for example, group all the people less than 5 together. And we're going to have to group all the 5 to 10-year-olds together and all the 10 to 15-year-olds together, et cetera. When you do that, some of the highs and lows cancel out a little bit. But we're going to have to reevaluate how we use the data. And it's going to be a lot more difficult to just download the data and use them. We're going to have to massage them in some way to make them usable. Another thing I've just beginning to realize, and I don't have any charts for this, for the most part, a lot of people haven't looked at block level data and how that works with differential privacy. But we're starting to realize that the block level data from the test product is really, really noisy. In particular, it looks like in every state, you can actually get more accurate block level counts by not using the block level data. What I mean is if you take the block group data and then allocate people down to blocks just using housing unit counts, that's actually more accurate than the noisy block level data. So they're starting to realize that there's some serious issues with block level data using differential privacy. Actually, if I can go back up to this chart here, one thing to note about differential privacy is that in general, the same amount of noise is added to every single level. So if you add a few hundred or a few thousand people to the male population of the United States, not a big deal. But if you add a few hundred or 1,000 people to the male population of the census tracts, suddenly that data may no longer be usable. And that's, I think, what we're seeing at the block level data is that just blocks are small and so much noise is being added that they may not be usable anymore. And I say may, it depends on what accuracy measure we choose. And so I don't know exactly how to report this out yet because there's some nuances here, but it does seem that the block level data may not be fit for use, at least the block level data that we've seen so far. So a lot of these results, and some of these results that I showed were ones that I had done. Some of them were results that other people had put together and shared with the Census Bureau at this committee back in December that was convened by the National Academy of Sciences. And the census now acknowledges that the test product they released that we looked at and that all these data are from is not fit for use. And this was a surprise for the census. They pretty much thought they had the algorithm ready to go. Largely that's because the Census Bureau had looked at county level data and thought it was good enough. But what they saw was that it's not fit for use, especially for incorporated places. Seeing results that I showed about how it impacts the distribution of taxes in Tennessee had an impact on people in the Census Bureau, and they hadn't really thought about that use case yet. So they now recognize that the test product was not fit for use for incorporated places. And something that doesn't affect Tennessee, but affects many other people is the other big hole in the test product was the population of American Indian areas. And so these are the two things that the Census Bureau is trying to work the most vigorously on improving, is improving their population counts for places and for American Indian areas. They are rapidly working on solutions and refinements to their differential privacy method. And they're refining both the differential privacy, the noisy part, and they're also refining the post-processing parts. What they're actually finding now is that the post-processing part is where most of the errors come in. Most of the errors don't come in through the noise part, it's through the post-processing part. At least that's what they're telling us. Census Bureau is sharing these with CNSAT, that's the National Academies Committee. They're also sharing it with some of the national level SDC networks and FSCPE networks, trying to get more feedback from stakeholders about what they're trying to do to improve it. But they're on a tight time frame now. They've got a little bit more than a year before they have to start releasing data. And the simple fact of the matter is that the algorithm isn't there yet. They don't have an algorithm yet that can produce usable data for all the levels of geography. I believe we get usable data for Tennessee and for the larger counties as is, but we would not get usable data for the tiny counties and especially for the tiny places. Something else that just was published a week or two ago. There's a group called JASON, maybe you've heard of them. It's an independent group of elite scientists. It was created after World War II, and they used to be very secret. They tend to work on issues of national security. But the Census Bureau contracted them to create a report and to report back on differential privacy. And this report was just published, as I said, a week or two ago. And it's something that a lot of people are talking about today, right now. Findings and recommendations from this report. One is there have been some question as to whether or not the riskiness of the 2010 data was real. So the census said that 17% of the data were 17% of the people might have their privacy taken away by the census. But the census said, we can't show you that research because then you know who these people were. And so that created a problem for a lot of people. Jason said, no, they looked at the results. They looked at the research. They had security clearance. They looked at the research. And they said, no, the re-identification risk is real. This is something that we should be concerned about. Something else, though, they said, was that the census did not perform appropriate risk assessments. In particular, what is the risk of releasing incorrect data to states? How is that going to impact decision-making at state and local levels? The JASON report took the Census Bureau to task for not doing due diligence in conducting that risk assessment. Some of the recommendations that this report had was for the Census Bureau to seriously evaluate whether or not they should produce fewer tables, but with larger epsilons. That means fewer tables, but with less noise. And in particular, to consider dropping blocks from the decennial census. Release things that block group or larger, or perhaps even asking states to come up with other geographies that are larger than blocks. If you want something for voting precincts, then give that to the Census Bureau. But the idea is they're pushing the census to think about what would happen if we dropped blocks. How would we do that? We haven't heard back from Census on this, but that charge was definitely in there in the Jason report. Think about how to do this without blocks. Also recommended that the census needs to do a much better job communicating with stakeholders, and so presumably that includes like the state data centers and a lot of the people here. So expect to hear better messaging from the census going forward. In particular, up to now, the Census Bureau has been saying that the Census Bureau needs to be determining how much noise is added. And they've got a high-level group called the Data Stewardship and Ethics Committee. It's a lot of the big wigs at the Census Bureau, but they're the ones that have been thinking about how much noise do we need to add. And the Jason report said, really they need to be doing that in much tighter consultation with stakeholders. And then something else that the Jason report mentioned, which I think is really interesting, is the Census Bureau has been arguing, actually let me back up. In 2010, the way the census protected privacy, or the way they thought they were protecting privacy, was to take tiny counts, like suppose there's 3 people in a block group who are Hispanic. You know, if you know 2 of them, then that creates a problem for the 3rd. And so the Census Bureau would protect privacy for tiny counts as they would swap people around. They never told us how many people they swapped, but they did swapping. And they believed that was enough, and it turns out it wasn't. And so Census believes that differential privacy means they don't have to do the swapping anymore. And what Jason has said and has recommended is that the census should do differential privacy and still apply those swapping procedures. And it's not entirely clear to me, but I think the intuition here is to kind of create a soft landing in the sense that suppose Census doesn't know how to apply differential privacy in time. Suppose we still have these issues with places and whatnot. If that's the case, then I think they're basically saying, well, Census, apply differential privacy, but don't add too much noise. If you don't add too much noise, you're not protecting people's privacy. So still do all the old 2010 swapping procedures to try to get privacy. That way, you'll have worked on this algorithm. Even if it's not good enough on its own, it's better than nothing. And you're not putting all of your eggs in the differential privacy basket, as it were. I thought that was a really interesting little recommendation in the report. This is a very current report. The point I want to leave you here at this last stage is this is very rapidly evolving in the Census Bureau. They're doing an agile programming approach in which they're basically doing a 6-week cycle in which they're refining differential privacy in the post-processing every 6 weeks and rerunning their numbers for the nation and calculating metrics for how close they were. They're not going to release another test product like they did in the fall. They hope that they can just release these metrics and that'll be good enough. Probably won't be. People are starting to be upset. But they're moving very quickly. And they're doing these sprint cycles of 6 weeks. And it's a very rapidly moving target as to how they're implementing it and what they've been able to correct and what they haven't been able to correct. So I'd like to say that a lot of the scary things I showed in the beginning about, we're going to get really unusable data for small places, that was certainly true in the first test product. Census saw that and said we need to improve. And they're trying to improve, and they're trying very rapidly. I just don't know how far they're going to get in the next year. I can be sure that what they're going to release is not the same as the test product, but how it's going to be different and how well it's going to work, we just don't know yet. I'd like to leave it there. hopefully I've left you with a better idea of what differential privacy is, why we're doing it, how it's being done, giving you kind of some scary slides about how this might affect us in bad ways. And then kind of showing you the fact this is moving very rapidly, and it's hard to say right now what it's going to look like in a year. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicholas. I'm sure there was some minds blowing when you mentioned the very word that blocks would potentially be considered for not being published in the 2020 census. I know everyone involved in redistricting, transportation planning, and the like are probably scratching their heads wondering how that could even happen. Just a reminder, if you do have any questions for Nicholas, if you want to throw them into the chat, go ahead and do so. My first question is kind of about redistricting and as someone who's stood in front of a county commission and a city council and a school board and talked about redistricting and the process of doing so. We always thought of the decennial census data in terms of absolutes, that it was true, that there wasn't swapping, there wasn't missing information imputed. So, I mean, how do you think someone could stand in front of a county commission and explain now that, well, these aren't real population counts, these are noise infused, or these are population counts that have been disaggregated from a block group? Because is that something we need to explain? Is this changing the expectations about the accuracy of privacy?
Well, it absolutely changes the expectations about accuracy. Census Bureau would like to say that they were never that accurate at the block level in the first place because they applied these swapping procedures, and they never told us about them. If you read the documentation, they said we applied these swapping procedures, but they also said we can't tell you how we swap. And so they've kind of opened this Pandora's box by, in some sense, making the sausage too transparent. And I believe that the sausage is worse than before. But the fact remains that it was always sausage. And transparency may not be a good thing.
Do you have, I mean, you kind of mentioned it, that, the idea of a soft landing, but do you think that the Census Bureau is 100% committed to using differential privacy as part of their disclosure avoidance in the 2020 census?
Yes, absolutely. Everything I've seen leads me to believe that they are 100% committed to differential privacy. And so why I thought that the Jason report definitely didn't use the word soft landing, those are mine, but why I thought that was interesting was I saw it as a way that Jason, I think, was trying to say, look, census, you can still apply differential privacy, but suppose you get to a situation in which you can't add a lot of noise. Census would say, well, that defeats the purpose. And I think they're saying, well, you can apply differential privacy, not add a lot of noise, still do the swapping. In my opinion, differential privacy was a really good 2030 topic. But they decided in a very short amount of time to apply it in 2020. And to be honest, the citizenship question debate had a huge part in why they decided to go full steam ahead with differential privacy in 2020. And so I definitely believe that the decision has been made that they are applying differential privacy. And I saw this as a way for them to basically apply differential privacy in Maine, but perhaps they don't add a lot of noise if that's what's needed to create usable data. And that buys the census time that they can continue refining it through 2030. But I absolutely believe that some form of differential privacy will be in place in 2020.
We don't have any other questions coming in, but I did want to mention something I know that I've heard. One of the things I'll do real quick is I'm going to drop into the chat. Hopefully that went through a newsletter that's being published, because one of the things that I've heard discussed is as it relates to the 2020 data products, not just the discussions around differential privacy, but potentially other tables that may or may not be published. The last time I heard of 2020 data products discussion, it included mention that the for instance, demographic profile summaries at the tract level would not be published. That the demographic profiles that a lot of people like to use are a very handy set of tables, maybe that describe all the different races and ages and ethnic makeup of an area. Wouldn't be a data product that you could use in as a result of the 2020 census. So there is a lot of discussion. This isn't an esoteric topic. This is a potential discussion about eliminating some of the data that we use out of the 2020 census data that we've had previously. So sign up for that newsletter. We're going to include it on a page that we're going to put up on the SDC website that we will give you an address to as a follow-up to this webinar. But have you heard anything else as far as, besides geography discussions, other tables or other sorts of information that may not be available?
Something that they're really struggling with are the detailed race tables. And they've been kind of holding the detailed race tables kind of off to the side for now. The thinking is that they're not going to be able to apply the same differential privacy algorithm to the detailed race tables. There are way more small counts, and there's a lot more biases created with the detailed race tables. And so they're thinking that basically they're going to have to create a separate product for the detailed race that uses a completely different methodology, if you will, for creating those tables. And we've heard very little about what that'll look like.
Okay, so there's still a lot to find out about this topic, is what it sounds like. I think one of the things that we'll ask, if there's interest among the people who are listening in submitting comments, we may want to try to collect those, and if you're interested in doing so, we can make a state level response and identify additional use cases that would be impacted through the application of differential privacy, and potentially through the elimination of some of these some of these discussions that you heard Nicholas talk about. So
states have written letters to the Census Bureau at the state level talking about how they believe differential privacy will negatively impact them. I mean, I do know that those sorts of stakeholder letters from high levels do have an impact.
So that's something that we'll look at. And as you can see, the revenue example is just one example of a use case in Tennessee that is statutorily mandated and could be impacted by this. We've always had an expectation of fairness when it comes to the census data. We expect it. We've always thought of it as truth. Maybe the transparency is the problem. So with that, that is the end of this webinar for today. I want to thank Nicholas for coming and for speaking to us.
Sure.
I'm sure you can find him online if you need to. And just as a reminder, also, we were recording this webinar. If you want to share it with anyone else who may not have been able to see it today, if you have any follow-up questions, you can email me directly, or if you want to get in touch with Nicholas, you can do so as well. And don't forget to sign up for that 2020 data products newsletter, because that'll be a really helpful thing to help you follow this conversation as it goes on over the next couple of months. And I hope you will share this information about the upcoming webinar that is scheduled for the 18th of June on the microdata access tool.
Can I ask a call to anyone out there? If other people know of statutory uses of census population counts in Tennessee, I would love to know those. I've been collecting examples from around the country. So if you know of other examples in Tennessee code that require the use of census data, I would love to know what those are.
Well, let me just throw one out there right now. We already know that there's a proposal out there to delay the delivery of the census data products from the 2020 census. Originally, we would have probably had them in late March. I know we're pounding the refresh key around March 21st, 22nd, waiting to see those state level information be released. That currently is scheduled to be moved back until around July 31st, I think, would be the deadline for the delivery of those products due to the COVID-19 situation. So that is one that may be impacted. I know that there's a few folks that are concerned with that, but you may have some concerns at the local level as well in those local statutes. So please try to share those too. Okay, I think that's it. And I want to thank Nicholas for presenting, and we hope that you will join us next month for our MDAT discussion. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.